Just after midnight on the night of August 12, 1961, trucks with soldiers and construction workers drove through East Berlin. They destroyed roads so cars couldn't drive on them, and they put up a fence and barbed wire on the 43-kilometer or 26.7-mile border between West and East Berlin. And shortly after, the entire West Berlin was fenced in with 97 miles of barbed wire. With no warning of what was about to happen, the citizens of Berlin woke up on August 13th to a new life, and not for the better. Passage from East Berlin to West Berlin was no longer possible, even though the Berlin Wall had separated people from their workplace and separated friends and family overnight. To mark the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall, I'll give you a crash course in the Berlin Wall. So by the end of this video, you'll know why the wall was put up in the first place, what it meant for the people living in Germany at the time, and why it fell. To understand why the Berlin Wall was put up, we need to go back in time to the end of World War II. After World War II, Germany was divided between the Allied powers, the US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The so-called Allied Control Council was located in Berlin and consisted of leaders from the Allied powers, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. And they needed to come to an agreement about Germany's future after it had been ripped apart during World War II. They decided to divide Germany into 4 sectors: 1 American, 1 British, 1 French, and 1 Soviet. And even though Berlin was located in the Soviet sector, it too was divided between the 4 powers. However, it wasn't long before cooperation between the Soviet Union and the other Allied powers crumbled. The US, Britain, and France stuck together, and their sectors of Germany became known as West Germany. Joseph Stalin wanted to be the only power in Berlin, so he tried to force the other leaders to abandon the city. The Soviet sector of Berlin became known as East Berlin. During the 1950s, many East Germans fled to the West because of poor economy in the East and because of the fear of living in a non-democratic communist country. From 1949 to 1961, it's estimated that 3 million Germans immigrated from East Germany, or the GDR as it's also called, to the West. East Germany wouldn't be able to survive such a huge loss of their population and workforce, since it was primarily the young and highly educated people that left. In July 1961, more than 30,000 people fled East Germany. The road from East to West Germany almost always went through Berlin because the rest of Germany had borders with very strict border control, but not in Berlin. Here it was still possible to freely move from the east to the west, and because of that, the leaders of the GDR decided that the only solution was to lock their people up. And now we've circled back to the night in 1961 when the Berlin Wall was built. It started out with simple barbed wire and guards to guard the fence. However, the leaders of the GDR quickly started to expand upon the fence to make it impossible for the citizens to flee. In 1962, a new fence was built behind the first one, and everything between these 2 fences, including houses, was bulldozed and covered in sand to make it easier for the guards to spot people on the run. This area between the 2 fences was called the Death Strip because its sole purpose was to give the guards in the guard tower a clear view of people trying to escape, so it would be easier for the guards to shoot them. In 1965, the GDR started to build the concrete wall that we know as the Berlin Wall today. This part of the wall was built to prevent people from driving a car through the barbed wire and escaping that way. The wall was completed in 1980 and consisted of 45 kilometers of reinforced concrete and was 3.6 meters high and 1.2 meters wide. It had 116 guard towers guarded by 1,200 soldiers. The only way to cross the border between West and East Berlin was through one of the 9 official crossing points. However, these were reserved for citizens of West Berlin and foreigners that were passing through. In theory, it was possible for the citizens of East Berlin to get an official permit to cross the border to West Berlin. However, in reality, it was almost impossible. Typically, by applying for permission to cross the border, the citizens of East Berlin risked getting investigated by the Stasi, which was the official state security service of the GDR, which meant that they'd likely get accused of treason. Despite all this crazy border control, 5,000 citizens of East Germany managed to escape to the west and freedom. During the first couple of years, people used cars to escape and drive through the barbed wire. However, when the concrete wall was put up, the East Germans needed to get a bit more creative. Some people dug tunnels underneath the wall. Others flew hot air balloons over it. And underneath Germany and the Berlin Wall, there was a sewage system that many people used to escape until it was discovered by the GDR and closed down. The guards had been told to shoot everybody that tried to cross the border, and they were told to not hold back. They were allowed to shoot everybody, even women and children. Because according to the leaders of the GDR, it was a tactic that traitors often used. There's some disagreement about exactly how many people died trying to escape the wall, but it's about 200 people that died that way. Right from the beginning, people on both sides of the border hated the Berlin Wall. However, at the end of the 1980s, this resentment grew even more. In 1987, the American President Ronald Reagan visited West Berlin, and in a speech he said,
"Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
Mikhail Gorbachev was the General Secretary of the Soviet Union at the time. The speech went around the world and also reached East Germany, where the people realized that the Western world supported their wish for freedom. The catalyst for the fall of the Berlin Wall happened in June 1989, where Communist Hungary decided to remove the border fence between Hungary and Austria. And suddenly, thousands of East Germans decided to go on vacation to Hungary and escape through Austria. Of course, the leaders of the GDR knew what was happening and tried to stop it, which resulted in mass protests in East Germany. So in an attempt to try to calm the commotion in the country, the leaders of the GDR decided to ease up a bit on the requirements to get permission to enter West Germany. This new decision was presented at a press conference on November 9th, 1989. That's 30 years ago. By Günter Schabowski. He had just been named the unofficial spokesman of the GDR, and right before the press conference he had been handed a text with the new travel regulations. However, the text wasn't very specific about some of the details. So when one of the reporters at the press conference asked when these regulations would come into effect, Schabowski answered, "As far as I know, effective immediately without delay." However, in reality, these new regulations were only supposed to get slowly implemented the next day. So when the East Germans heard this chaotic press conference, they were excited. So thousands of people showed up at the Berlin Wall and were met by guards that had no idea what was going on. The guards tried to control the masses until they had gotten a clear instruction on what to do next. But even their generals didn't know who was in charge at this moment, and the crowd was only getting bigger and bigger. And luckily, none of the soldiers were ready to shoot that many civilians and cause a massacre. So around 11:30 at night, the leaders of the GDR had to give up and let the people pass through to West Berlin. On the other side of the border, the East Germans were met by West Germans with flowers and champagne. And bold young people on both sides of the wall climbed the Berlin Wall and met, danced, and celebrated their freedom. So this moment could have been a big disaster, but luckily it became a big party that celebrated the end of 28 years of separation and confinement.
We have been waiting for this moment for 28 years.
Shortly after this moment, the citizens took matters into their own hands and started to tear down the wall with hammers and chisels. Technically, this was illegal, but at this point, the guards wasn't even trying to stop people. A couple of days later, the GDR announced a couple of new crossing points and started to bulldoze sections of the wall. So the fall of the Berlin Wall had finally become a reality after 28 years of suppression. This was also a landmark event that signaled the end of the Cold War that had shaped the world after World War II. In October 1990, the two parts of Germany were finally reunited. So that was it for this crash course about the Berlin Wall. So now you know what happened on this very important day 30 years ago. I hope you liked this video and that you'll push that little thumbs up button if you did. Remember to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. And let me know in the comments below if you want me to cover other events in history. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.